Colonel Georgy Ortyukov's boots broke through the crust of snow with a sound like snapping bones, and he stopped there on the slope of Kholat Syakhl, not because he was tired, though exhaustion had settled into his marrow like the cold itself, but because the wind had died in that unnatural way that precedes disaster, and in the sudden silence, he saw the tent. It shouldn't have been visible from this distance, not after the blizzard that had screamed across these mountains for 3 days. Yet there it was, a pale gray smudge against the endless white, listing to one side like a wounded animal trying to stand. The colonel felt his stomach turn to ice, colder than the Ural winter that wrapped its fingers around his throat, because he knew that 9 people had entered that tent 3 weeks ago, 9 healthy, experienced hikers with food for 20 days and equipment worth a fortune in ration cards. 3 of them engineers, 2 military veterans, all of them possessing wilderness skills that made the local Mansi tribesmen nod in respect. And now there was only silence bleeding across the snowfield. And blood, so much blood that he could smell it even in the freezing air. As he approached, his flashlight caught the first detail that would haunt Soviet military intelligence for the next 6 decades. The tent had been cut open from the inside. 9 neat vertical slashes, made with something sharp, knives or perhaps the edges of mess tins, sliced through the heavy canvas, the frayed edges pointing outward like petals of some frozen, deadly flower. The entrance was still tied shut, secured against the wind, yet the occupants had chosen to slash their way out rather than use the door, and inside, the tent held everything it should have held. Boots lined up in neat rows, coats hanging from a clothesline strung across the center, axes and cameras and backpacks and tins of pork and crackers and matches. Everything needed to survive the harshest winter, everything except the 9 people who should have been wearing them. Ortyukov knelt down, his knees cracking in the cold, and touched the snow around the tent, finding the footprints that the rescue party would photograph before the next storm erased them forever. 9 sets of tracks leading away from the tent in an orderly, almost military formation, heading downhill toward the cedar forest a kilometer away, and these were not the tracks of booted feet. Some wore only socks. Some were barefoot. One wore a single shoe on the left foot. They had walked, not run, away from their only shelter into temperatures of minus 25 degrees Celsius, into a wind that could freeze exposed skin in 15 minutes, and they had left their boots behind. The colonel followed the tracks with his eyes, tracing them down the slope to the darkness of the pine forest below, and it was there, near the treeline, that his men found the first body. Yuri Doroshenko lay under a large cedar tree, his body twisted in a position that suggested he had been trying to climb it, his hands shredded and bloody from tearing at the bark, wearing only a sweater that did not belong to him and his underwear. His hair singed as if by fire, foam frozen on his lips from pulmonary edema that had filled his lungs with ice from the inside out. Beside him lay Georgy Ortyukov, similarly dressed, similarly frozen, his hands equally destroyed from climbing, and between them lay the remains of a small fire that had never fully caught, a pathetic pile of birch branches torn from the lower limbs of the tree above them. Both men had soft tissue damage inconsistent with simple freezing, and when Ortyukov's radioman passed a Geiger counter over Krivonischenko's clothing, the device clicked and chattered with the unmistakable signature of radiation contamination, beta particles clinging to the fabric like invisible dust, which made no sense because these were engineering students from Sverdlovsk, not workers from a nuclear facility, and the nearest reactor was hundreds of miles away. 300 meters from the cedar tree, closer to the tent, they found Igor Dyatlov himself, the leader of the expedition, a 23-year-old radio engineer who had been legendary among the hiking clubs of the Ural Polytechnic Institute for his competence and calm. He was on his knees, his head buried in snow as if he had collapsed while trying to dig a snow cave, wearing a single shoe and a coat that was unbuttoned despite the cold, a stripped branch clutched in his frozen hand, and his body showed no external wounds but his hyoid bone was fractured, suggesting strangulation, while his stomach was empty, indicating he had survived for at least 6 hours after leave. The search continued, and 15 days later they found Rustem Slobodin, a former artilleryman who had served in the Soviet army before returning to his engineering studies. His body positioned 480 meters from the cedar tree, closer to the tent than Dyatlov, wearing both shoes but no coat. His skull fractured with a force that should have killed him instantly, a 3 by 4 centimeter depression on the right temporal bone. And yet there was no external bleeding, no bruising. On the skin, as if he had been struck by a weapon that left no mark, or had fallen onto rock while walking. though the snow was soft and deep and there were no rocks nearby. Then came Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22 years old, dark hair frozen in a braid, her body lying 630 meters from the Cedar with her arms outstretched toward the tent as if reaching for salvation, wearing 2 sweaters and 1 boot, her chest crushed, ribs fractured on the right side, blood pooled in her pleural cavity, dying while trying to crawl back up the slope to whatever had driven them down. These were the first 5, but there were 4 more, and they were not found until May, when the snow began to melt in the ravine 75 meters beyond the cedar tree, buried under 4 meters of snow that had fallen since their deaths. These 4 had shown more organization than the others. Unlike the first group, who had apparently died separately while attempting to return to the tent, these 4 had built a shelter, digging a den into the snow at the bottom of the ravine, lining it with branches and spare clothing, removing garments from the dead bodies at the cedar tree. Lyudmila Dubinina was found wearing Krivonischenko's sweater, turned inside out and saturated with his radioactive sweat, and they had survived longer, perhaps a full day, before something found them therein, that hole in the snow, and killed them with impossible violence. Alexander Zolotaryov was found with a notebook clutched in his hand, blank pages staring up at the sky, wearing sunglasses despite the darkness in which he had died. His chest crushed so completely that multiple ribs were broken on both sides, front and back. His scapula shattered, massive internal bleeding turning the snow around him red despite the frozen state of his body. Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, the French-Russian aristocrat of the group, lay nearby with his skull crushed beyond recognition, major fractures to the right temporal bone, his brain damaged by bone fragments driven into it by a force equivalent to a high-speed car crash. Yet his skin was unbroken, not a scratch on his face. Lyudmila Dubinina, the poet of the group who had sketched the mountains and written dark verses about isolation, had suffered the worst injuries of all. Her ribs 2 through 9 were broken on the left side, ribs 2 through 8 on the right, both costal arches smashed, her heart hemorrhaging from the pressure, and she was missing her tongue, not bitten off or torn, but removed cleanly from the root, the blood in her stomach suggesting she had swallowed it while it was being excised, or that it had been removed while she was still alive, her eyes also gone, plucked from the sockets with surgical precision or eaten by scavengers, though the rest of her face was untouched. Beside her lay Alexander Kolevatov, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle, his body showing signs of extreme heat damage. His clothes melted and fused to his skin in patches, though there was no fire in the ravine, no fuel, only snow, and he was dressed in layers of clothing that belonged to the others, dressed by his companions after he had died or while he was dying, dressed in a patchwork of coats and sweaters that spoke of a final, desperate attempt to keep warm or to prepare the dead for a burial that never came. Prosecutor Lev Ivanov, a stern man with a reputation for thoroughness, spent weeks at the investigation revealed that these were not ordinary students. They were the best of the Ural Polytechnic Institute's hiking club, selected through trials that would break lesser athletes. Igor Dyatlov had designed the radio equipment for the expedition. Zinaida Kolmogorova could outski most men in the department. Rustam Slobodin had military training. Yuri Doroshenko was built like a bear and carried a camera everywhere. They had left Sverdlovsk on January 27th, traveling by lumber truck to the settlement of Vizhay, then skiing north through forests of birch and pine that stood like white cathedral columns in the winter landscape. By February 1st, they had covered 200 kilometers, their route taking them toward Otorten Mountain, a Category 3 difficulty climb, when they encountered an ice field that had opened up due to unseasonably warm weather. Rather than risk the crossing, Dyatlov made the decision to camp on the shoulder of Kholat Syakhl, the Mountain of the Dead, a place the local Mansi tribesmen refused to approach, citing ancient curses and stories of hunters who had vanished there in 1935, found with their tent cut open from the inside, their food uneaten, their faces twisted in expressions of absolute terror. Yuri Yudin, the 10th member of the group, had turned back at the edge of the tree line on February 1st, his leg injured and weak, saving his life and condemning him to decades of survivor's guilt. He had warned them, mentioning that the Mansi guides at the village had spoken of lights in the sky, orange lights that had appeared before the disappearance of the hunters in 1935, lights that the Mansi called the fiery orbs and associated with death. The group had laughed it off as superstition, with Slobodin dismissing the Mansi as primitive people who saw wolverine tracks and thought they were snow demons, But they had still allowed Yudin to leave, embracing him before continuing into the white unknown, 9 figures pulling sleds into a law. The last known photograph taken inside the tent shows them smiling, making silly faces at the camera, posed in a moment of youth and confidence and invincibility that is heartbreaking to look upon knowing what came next. Dyatlov's final journal entry, written on the evening of February 1st, notes only that the weather was getting warmer and the wind was strong, that they were resting after lunch and would make the climb to Otorten later. Then, around 11 p.m., something happened. The cameras found in the snow, scattered in the tent and the ravine, contained frames that would drive analysts mad for decades. Images of the night sky blurred by motion, showing 4 orange spheres of light hovering over the treeline, geometric and defined, not stars, captured on film by Thibaut Brignolles between 7 o'clock and 9 p.m., before the group died. Zolotaryev's camera held a frame showing 3 dark figures against a white background, underexposed and blurry, wearing thick coats and perhaps helmets, figures who were not members of the Dyatlov group, taken after the group was dead or dying, or perhaps before, the timeline uncertain and disturbing. The Soviet investigation, taken over by the KGB within days, concluded that the cause of death was a natural force they were unable to overcome. But the files were sealed with top-secret classification, and Colonel Ortyukov and Prosecutor Ivanov were ordered to stop asking questions by higher-ups who were afraid, though of what they never said. The theories proposed over the next 60 years range from the scientific to the supernatural, each attempting to explain the unexplainable. The avalanche theory, suggesting a slab of snow had struck the tent and driven the hikers out, disoriented and suffering from shock, though the slope angle was only 15 degrees, too shallow for a slab avalanche, and the tent was not buried, and avalanches do not crush rib cages like a vice while leaving skin unbroken, nor do they remove tongues or cause. Then there is the phenomenon of paradoxical undressing, where hypothermia victims, feeling hot due to nerve damage as their core temperature drops, tear off their clothes and dig holes in the snow, exhibiting terminal burrowing behavior that explains the removal of garments and the digging of the snow den, but cannot account for the massive internal trauma, the fractured skulls, the crushed chests that required force equivalent to a high-speed car crash to achieve. The ball lightning theory suggests high-altitude electrical discharges, plasma orbs that could cause the burns on Kolevatov's clothing and the radiation, but ball lightning is typically small and rarely causes such extensive physical damage. The katabatic wind theory proposes sudden, violent downhill winds that struck the tent with hurricane force, driving the hikers out to seek shelter in the treeline, but does not explain why they did not return or what killed them in the ravine. In 2019, the Russian government reopened the investigation using modern DNA testing and 3D modeling of the injuries, concluding finally that it was indeed a slab avalanche, a rare type of delayed slab that triggered after the hikers cut the snow platform, causing them to flee in panic and later falling into a snow hole in the ravine. But the families rejected this, hikers rejected this, the evidence did not support it, and the case was closed again in 2020 with the mystery intact. The radiation unexplained, the tongue and eyes unexplained, the orbs in the sky unexplained, the force that crushed Lyudmila Dubinina's chest like a squeezing cage unexplained. Yuri Yudin, who lived until 2013, spent his life visiting the pass every year, walking the route his friends had taken, looking for answers in the snow, and in his final interview, he said that it was not an avalanche, not soldiers, not an animal, but something else, something that lives in the spaces between the snowflakes, in the howl of the wind, in the dark when the fire goes out, something so terrible that 9 rational, experienced people chose the certainty of freezing to death over. Facing it, cutting their way out of their tent and walking into the night with bare feet, something that followed them to the cedar tree and waited while they froze, or killed them in the ravine with forces unknown, something that the mountain keeps still, buried under the snow that falls year after year, hiding the footprints that lead away from the tent and into the abyss, 9 sets of tracks that walk down the slope of Kholat Syakhl forever, toward the cedar tree and the ravine and the darkness beyond, where the orange lights hover and the wind screams like a living thing, and where, on winter nights when the moon is gone and the cold is absolute, you can still see them, 9 figures in gray wool walking down the mountain, away from the tent with its 9 neat slashes, away from safety, into the white silence that swallowed them whole and keeps its secret still 65 years later, waiting for the next group of hikers to pitch their tents on the wrong slope, to see the lights in the sky, to hear the singing that the Monsi spoke of, to feel the overwhelming urge to run, to cut, to flee, to die, becoming another mystery in the Mountain of the Dead, where the snow remembers everything and reveals nothing, where the 9 are buried in the Mihailovsko cemetery in Ekaterinburg, but their spirits still walk the pass, still trying to get back to the tent, still reaching for the boots they left behind, still crushed by the invisible force that descended on them in the Ravine.